Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined by Scott Ritter, a former major U.S. Marine and a UN weapons inspector, to discuss the mounting tensions now between NATO and Russia. So welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Well, NATO countries now, they accuse Russia of violating both Polish and Romanian airspace with these decoy drones. Some have referred to this as attack, calling for a no-fly zone. In response, we have a former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, arguing that this would mean direct war. Then you have the Kremlin spokesperson, Peskov, coming out saying that NATO is already de facto at war with Russia. This is all happening while the Russians and Belarusians are having their Zapad military exercise. What do you see going on here? Is this a possibility of spiraling towards World War III, or is it just, I guess, a lot of noise?
Well, first of all, anytime you have NATO and Russia involved in anything that could lead to potential direct conflict, it's a danger and should be treated very seriously. And this current crisis should be treated very seriously. But let's understand reality. Russia did not attack Poland, and Russia did not attack Romania. Um, the Romanian drone could have been a drone that was deviated off course because of electronic warfare, some other action. The idea that Russia would send a single reconnaissance drone or a decoy drone into Romania is absurd facially. And the Polish incident appears to be, and even the Poles are having trouble denying this, that it's just a Ukrainian setup. Initially, I thought that, based upon the data that was available early on, that these were Shahed 136 Geranium-2 type drones that, according to the Belarusian Ministry of Defense, had been, captured by Ukrainian electronic warfare capabilities and diverted, into Poland. That doesn't appear to be the case. These appear to be disposable decoy drones that Ukraine has accumulated over time and repaired and then sent them into Poland in a premeditated, coordinated event, meaning that this didn't take the Poles by surprise. The Poles knew exactly what was happening, and it's all played to a script that basically has the Poles declaring an Article 4 emergency for the purpose of generating a NATO surge of resources into Poland. But that's just a front, because the surge of resources is actually pretty pathetic. 2 Eurofighters for Britain. I'm sure the Russians are losing a lot of sleep over that one. 3 Rafales from France. Again, wow. I think there was 2 more fighters sent in from Germany. So the British, the Germans, and the French sent a total of, 7 fighters. America sent 10 F-35s to Puerto Rico because of one Venezuelan, alleged drug smuggling ship. So it just tells you that the Europeans aren't serious about this at all. The Poles, surged another 40,000 or 40,000 troops to the border, but that's not real military power. It's nothing. The big news here is that Ukraine now is going to be training NATO air defenses in how to intercept Russian drones and missiles. This is where it gets problematic, because now what is happening is that we're creating a military force in Poland that will be able to almost immediately meld itself into Ukraine's integrated air defense, should the decision be made to extend this air defense umbrella into Western Ukraine. In the past, one of the big blocks was you just can't plug NATO into Ukraine. But now they're creating a situation where you can plug NATO into Ukraine. Ukraine is being plugged into NATO right now as we speak. This is the danger, that NATO will become empowered, emboldened, or Poland might become unilaterally emboldened into believing that they can make a move on Western Ukraine. And that's where we get into the potential force on force conflict and it spins out of control. But this was a 100% setup. The United States knows this. I mean, this is why Donald Trump's not losing any sleep over what's happening here. If for a moment we thought that this was a serious Russian incursion, you'd see American resources being surged in, but we're not playing that game. So this is a political game that everybody knows is a political game. The problem is the consequences of this political game are creating a military capability that can plug straight into a NATO military capability. Once it's finished being trained up, we'll be able to plug straight into Ukraine's integrated air defense in a seamless fashion.
So the problem is, yeah, they're setting up preparation and for possibly entering the war. Now, often it's dismissed because the Europeans do not have that much capabilities. They can't really act without the United States, and so far the US looks, well, it seems disinterested. However, there's always the concern that desperation will increase as Ukraine now, I think everyone who's seriously watching this are admitting that Ukraine is collapsing. So if the Ukrainian army is collapsing on the front, not at a rapid speed, but it's intensifying, it seems, the Europeans and NATO only have two options: either sit down, talk, and bring an end to this war, or escalate. And given that the Europeans do not refuse to even sit down and talk to the Russians, it kind of only leaves escalation left. I mean, how are you reading the general European approach to this war in terms of what it might do in the final stages?
Well, it's clear they're not going to escalate in a meaningful fashion. They don't have the ability to do this. I go back to, I think it was earlier this summer when Mr. Narishkin, the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, I guess they held some sort of seminar where they discussed, what Ukraine could look like in a post-conflict scenario. And one of the things that was actively discussed was Western Ukraine being given to the Poles, meaning allowing the Polish to take over. I think this may be the safety valve here. I'll call it controlled escalation. As Ukraine itself devolves, dissolves, disintegrates, you will see a retreat of Ukrainian governmental resources to the west, in Lvov and other cities, along with Ukrainian military resources, aircraft and things of that nature. At some point in time, I believe that part of the demilitarization plan of Russia is to allow Poland to extend, and this will be a humanitarian crisis as well, with millions of Ukrainians fleeing to the west, to create the conditions in which Poland can occupy Western Ukraine. In order to do that, Poland will have to extend its air defense into Western Ukraine. And I think that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at a scenario of a controlled collapse of Ukraine. Because now what happens? Poland will not allow a viable Ukrainian military to remain intact on territory that is under the control of Poland. So the Poles now will have demilitarization obligations to, you know, to take this equipment away from a Ukrainian military that will be, in effect, disarmed by NATO. And also denazification. If you think the Poles, especially under their current president, are going to tolerate a Banderist Ukrainian government in Western Ukraine controlled by Poland, think again. And I think this is, a politically elegant solution that Narishkin apparently was considering. Whether or not Vladimir Putin concurs or whether or not the situation will, evolve to where this becomes a possibility, it's unknown. But I don't see any scenario under which Europe does an aggressive, meaningful intervention designed to, have a meeting engagement with Russian forces. What I see is Poland beginning the process of being prepared for a controlled absorption of Western Ukraine into the Polish sphere of influence. This is why you see 40,000 troops moving to the border. This is why you see talk about, air defense integration, etc.
Would this just be a natural part of the disintegration then of Ukraine, or do you think it would be like the Poles and the Russians might come to a post-conflict settlement where the Russians would actually accept this, as you indicated? There's been talks about this because would this fit within a concept of a security guarantee then, if the western parts of Ukraine would be under some kind of a Polish protection, which would be a gradual absorption? Again, I think people underestimate that it's not the construct of Ukraine. It's not just the Russians who have some problems with it. The Poles, Romanians, Hungarians. There's a lot who might look to, I guess, reset some of these deals which were previously made.
Well, I mean, again, that same conference where Naryshkin and company contemplated Western Ukraine falling under a Polish sphere of influence, they also talked about Carpathia going to Hungary and other territories going to Romania as well. So we're looking at the partition of Ukraine. I believe that, look, we know that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has said any Polish incursion into Western Ukraine will automatically bring Belarus into the war because they won't allow that. So any Polish incursion into Western Ukraine, I believe, can't happen without the Russians greenlighting up front, which means that there probably already is an understanding between Russia and Poland. That's just how intelligence services work. That there is an understanding because neither side wants World War III. Nobody's looking for a conflict, and everybody understands that this has to be a controlled demolition of Ukraine. You can't just let it come down on its own because that leads to too many uncertainties and unpredictable outcomes. The goal here would be to create the most predictable outcome possible. Europe, of course, wants to avoid this because what we're talking about is, an uncontested Russian victory, a total defeat for NATO. But the idea of letting Russia win and not having a plan to stabilize the region, I think is, especially from a Polish perspective, unthinkable. So the Poles here have to be prepared to help with the controlled demolition of Ukraine.
It seems drastic, but on the other hand, to suggest that Poland is not making any plans for what's going to happen to post-war Ukraine, it does seem a bit silly. As well, you have to adjust to reality as it is. But as you suggested, the Europeans might not be on board here, though. Indeed, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, he still insists that Ukraine is on a path to NATO membership. He is still saying that in an eventual ceasefire, troops will be sent into Ukraine. And of course, Russia should have no veto on any of this. That even discussing a Russian veto would somehow be, or Russians say, would be ridiculous. So they're still insisting on this very maximalist stance. But that's why I'm worried that even though they don't have the capabilities to fight the Russians, it might not be it might happen nonetheless if it's not a rational decision, because we now have all this talk about sending more long-range missiles. It's not fair that Ukraine has all these constraints. But while the Europeans are getting a bit panicked, we see on the other side the Russians, which are more, it appears to me at least, hearing from Moscow, that they're getting more angry. They are well aware that they have, the Oreshnik and other ways of dealing with an escalation. And also there might be some calculation that the US is less likely to intervene if there would be a serious escalation between the Europeans and Russia. Now, how do you see this as a possibility that the Russians might again? I'm not sure if I spoke to the Dmitry Polyansky yesterday, is the representative Russia in the United Nations. He said that this was a Ukrainian false flag operation, but again, one can't rule out that also the Russians might be sending the West a signal. I'm not sure if that's the case, but do you see any possibility that we might be moving into a direct war, at least between the Europeans and Russia, if not bringing in the Americans?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that the United States sent military observers to the Zapad 2025 exercises. Total shot out of the blue, but 2 lieutenant colonels are on the ground in Belarus, given the ability to monitor the totality of these exercises. This isn't what you do if you're worried about a conflict with the United States. This is what you do when you're trying to convince the United States that, that you pose no threat. The other thing is we just have to deal with reality. Look, when my kids were told them that Santa Claus was real, and I said that Rudolph will bring the reindeer to our home, land on our roof, and Santa Claus will come down the chimney and put gifts under the tree. And I did this as long as the kids were willing to believe it. This is Mark Rutte today, because any notion that NATO is going to intervene is like selling the story of Santa Claus. It's not real. It's not going to happen. There is no intervention that NATO can do. None. Zero. What the Germans are going to provide Taurus missiles. That's a death sentence for Germany, and they know it. But they're not going to do that. This is just all posturing. This is just ridiculous stupidity. No NATO nation has the ability to initiate and sustain meaningful military operations against Russia. None. Even the Poles with 40,000, they wouldn't get 20 kilometers inside Western Ukraine before they logistically came to a halt. Poland is incapable of logistically supporting that kind of advance in peacetime. Now imagine under fire how quickly this advance will collapse and how quickly those 40,000 Polish troops will become dead, wounded, or prisoners of war. That's the reality. They're going up against a battle-hardened Russian military and a Belarusian military that's been trained by battle-hardened Russian soldiers, or in the case of Wagner, mercenaries. Poland knows this. They're not stupid. We're talking about professional military officers who know how to read a map, and they know how to read a balance of power ledger, and they understand what's going on here. This is all political nonsense that's being played out here. There will be no European military intervention, not without the United States backing it up with its full military power. And I just told you, the United States put 2 military observers on the ground in Belarus, not to spy on them for future military actions, but to send a signal. We understand we're looking for stability here. We're not looking for confrontation. We're not looking for surprises. That's the reality. There will be no major European military intervention. First of all, in order to do this, you need support of your people. And I don't see support coming out of France, and I don't see support coming out of the United Kingdom, and I don't see support coming out of Germany. And frankly, I don't see support coming out of Poland either. The vast majority of the Polish people are against the concept of going to war with Russia. So this is just a fantasy on the part of Rutte, who's looking at NATO collapsing around his eyes. I mean, it's over. I said when Rutte was brought in as the Secretary General, I said he could very well be the last Secretary General that NATO ever has. And I think it's becoming more and more likely that this could indeed be the case. And he's not going to go gently into that good night. He'll go screaming, screaming, screaming. But it doesn't change the fact that NATO is a failed institution. They're not going to be able to afford the kind of repair work necessary to turn them into a credible military organization. And this strategic defeat that they will suffer at the hands of Russia will be the death knell for not just them, but for Europe.
I guess my concern is that it wouldn't be either no intervention or intervention, but this incrementalism, which we've seen over the past 3.5 years, because there's always room for miscalculation, as the New York Times revealed. I think everyone knew that it was has mainly been U.S. generals running the war out of Germany, providing logistics, intelligence, the targeting, even with some of these long-range missiles being operated by Westerners. So I guess my concern is that Rutte himself believes in Santa Claus, that the Russians won't do anything in return, because we have all this gradual incrementalism, and the Russians never do anything. So
But wait, Glenn,
yeah,
what do you mean the Russians are? They killed 1.7 million Ukrainians.
yeah,
They
but
destroyed everything NATO sent their direction. Russia has, this is a war of attrition. I mean, that's the mistake that Keith Kellogg and others make, because you're not getting the big red arrows on the map. Obviously, Russia's not replicating the capture of Berlin, but that's not what this war is about. This war is about achieving the military collapse of Ukraine and NATO, which is happening as we speak, because 1.7 million Ukrainian soldiers are, no longer able to fight. There's, more than 2 million wounded out there. The all the equipment that NATO provides ends up in the scrap heaps, or it's, rotated back into Europe to be repaired, only to come back and die again. Um, Russia's destroyed everything. This is the sixth Ukrainian army Russia's destroying right now. The sixth time that NATO's rebuilt it. I'd say that it's quite obvious that Russia is defeating NATO across the board, hands down, no questions asked.
well, no, I hope you're right. I always hear, if they fear that the Russians would retaliate against the Taurus missiles, then suddenly you hear that, well, they can help the Ukraine and make their own missiles, which sounds as if they're just wiping the German fingerprints off it and redesigning a bit and then pretending it's a domestic missile. But of course, with all the drones that are being hit deep inside Russia, I just have a hard time believing that these drones are 100% manufactured within Ukraine, as the Russians will probably have discovered it. That being said, though, where do you see this war going now? I mean, you are looking at the battlefield again. One primarily looks at the numbers, in the attrition numbers in a war of attrition, but some of the changes of territory as well seem significant. Do you think the Russians are preparing a massive offensive to finish it off, or are they going to continue this incrementalism? Are they looking to cut off key nodes or logistics centers? What do you think we should expect over the next weeks?
I don't anticipate the coup de grace that everybody's, this massive war-winning offensive. I see the Russians have a winning formula right now, and it's doing very well for them. Um, we still need to respect the fact that Ukraine has a very large military, and within this military, there are units that possess considerable combat power, and that Russia has to treat these units with respect, meaning that the last thing you want to do is do a repeat of the Soviet counteroffensive after Stalingrad, where they succeeded in surrounding the Sixth Army, but then they overshot, and that's what sent the Fourth Tank Army off. It got cut off, and everybody died. The Russians aren't in the business of, allowing their units to be sacrificed in that manner. Um, the war will end when Ukraine collapses militarily, economically, and politically. And there's a synergy between the three of those. There's connectivity. So the Russians right now will continue to destroy the Ukrainian military through a war of attrition that's also resulting in significant, territorial gains. Not the big arrows that, everybody expects from World War II, but, they're advancing 5 kilometers a day in some areas. That's not bad. They will continue the economic warfare. You're seeing that with their drones. They're taking out, critical defense industry targets, but they're also starting to hit energy-related infrastructure, et cetera. And politically, I mean, Zelensky's just in an outright panic right now, and everybody around him is in a panic. And I think what you'll see is that as the military degrades, the economy degrades, the political foundation of Zelensky's support will degrade. And at some point in time, you're going to see collapse. And when that collapse happens, then we're going to look at the potential of this controlled demolition of Ukraine, where Russia will now turn to the polls and say, now. and then the Poles will come in and take Western Ukraine while the Russians move in and consolidate with Kiev and Odessa and et cetera. There might be some demilitarized zone between the Russians and the Poles that's agreed upon to deconflict. Um, but this is the way I see this war going. I don't see big arrows. I don't see a major offensive design to solve this. I see the Russians, knowing that as long as Europe is able to flood Ukraine with military resources, that Ukraine will fight to the last Ukrainian. And unfortunately for Ukraine, there's still a lot of Ukrainian manhood out there that is capable of being sacrificed on the field of battle. And Russia will just continue grinding this down until you get the collapse across the three pillars that I discussed.
My last question is just about Trump. How are you reading? How does America fit into all of this? I mean, with the collapse of Ukraine, is it just going to wash his hands saying, well, we did what we could, this is Europe's problem, or will they attempt to rescue the situation? He still insists this is not his war, but he still makes threats against Russia. Again, I'm not sure if it's to appease the hawks at home. He's pushing the Europeans to put secondary sanctions on Russia. Again, I'm not sure if that's to push the Russians to the negotiation table or just make sure that the Europeans have isolated themselves in the world and become captured by the United States in terms of not having any other trading partners. It's very hard to read. I hear from both Americans and Russians who are in the know that the bilateral developments of relations is improving. That it's not, things are happening. But how are you reading Trump? Because this is always a difficult thing to do. But do you think this is for show, or is he simply carrying on Biden's legacy? How are you assessing any of this?
No, I think every once in a while, if you listen to Donald Trump, the truth will work its way out of his mouth. And he just this week said that the Ukraine-Russian conflict was just too hard. I mean, it's proven much harder than he thought it could be. Um, so what he's done is he's created conditions that are unattainable. He's playing the tough guy. I'm willing to do this. I'm willing to collapse Russia's economy, but I can't go alone. Europe, you got to come in. You got to not only go after the Russian, stop buying Russian energy, which Europe can't do at this juncture, um, but you also have to uh, punish India and China with sanctions, which will destroy the European economy. Therefore, they can't do it. So Trump set forth in conditions that are impossible to reach. And I think he did it on purpose because now he can say Europe's not serious about ending this war. Therefore, don't expect us to bear the brunt of this. We're out of here. This is how he unplugs. And that will be part of the economic, military, and political collapse of Ukraine when the United States makes the strategic decision to unplug from Ukraine. And that'll be sooner rather than later. I don't think Trump's going to drag this thing out forever. He's given Europe a chance. I don't believe Europe's going to be able to meet the conditions that Trump has set. And there's no fallback position. At that point in time, Europe will be totally on their own. And because they can't sustain this kind of leverage, Ukraine will be compelled to, either accept a deal, which they won't, or, fight without adequate support, which will lead to collapse, which I think is ultimately going to be the outcome here, where Europe is going to be limited into what they can provide. The Ukraine will be starved of resources, military and economic. And you'll see, as I discussed earlier, there's a relationship between military, society, political, and economic collapse. And I think you'll see all three go down right about the same time.
Incompetence in Europe is really frustrating because if this is solved somehow with a deal now, which could be done, there would be you don't need the Ukraine's consent not to expand NATO, and as opposed to a collapse. I mean, a collapse would be a humanitarian disaster. They're just what would happen on the battlefield as things fall apart. The refugee floods. I mean, this is gonna be a horror show. I mean, the fact that they they staying loyal to narratives and not doing anything. It's starting to anger me, and all of this being done under this banner of, we care about the Ukrainians. It's quite despicable. But Scott Ritter, thank you so much as always for your time.
Thanks for having me.